So I'm sitting with Raoul, who is the editor and inventor of the mock Financial Times that you may have seen floating around the place over the last couple of weeks. So what are you hoping to achieve through the Spoof Financial Times? What was the aim?
Well, I guess there were lots of aims. I wanted to focus on climate change because I think that's something that, although there is a lot of news coverage about, is kind of addressed in the wrong way. And the reason I chose the Financial Times is because that seems to me the core issue that's being neglected. Mm-hmm. A lot of people care about the state of the world, a lot of people are worried about what's happening to the climate, but they're not necessarily focused on what's stopping us solving the problem. Of course, there are all sorts of complicated issues about who goes first and who does what, and exactly who shoulders what share of the burden. But the main problem is, and always has been, and was very well summed up by the first President Bush, which was that the American way of life is non-negotiable. And what that really means is, basically, we want the economy to keep on growing. We all want to keep getting rich exponentially every year, endlessly. And no way are we going to negotiate some deal that requires us to rein in economic growth, which is basically the source of large numbers of carbon emissions. The idea was to try and poke a bit of fun at journalists, but also to try and do something quite serious, and to do it in a way that actually embodied something rather than just complaining. There's a lot of people who've got a lot of bad things to say about journalism, and I think with good reason, but I think in some ways that the most effective way to demonstrate what you think is wrong with something is to show what might be right with it. So we tried to write a paper set in the future, imagining that good things had happened, and showing what could be achieved if journalists, like activists, were more successful at influencing positive outcomes.
Previous to April 1st, there was a lot of coverage in the news and the media about, this doomed day. All hell is going to break loose. There was a lot of, I would call it scaremongering. Others would.
I would agree with you entirely. I think basically scaremongering suits the police and it suits journalists. The police get to say, here's this terrible threat to society, and they either save the day or they show you that the world is really quite nasty and therefore they need more power to control it. And journalists get a good story either way. They talk it up beforehand, basically because the police are talking it up and also because some protesters are talking it up, saying what fantastic actions they're going to pull off. And then either these things happen and they can have a great story about them happening, or they get crushed and they've got a great story about them being crushed. It's all sensation, it's all drama, and the spectacle is what makes for a good news day for the average hack.
And what do you think the effect of the hyped up pre-protest talk was on the demonstrations?
I guess some people stayed away, thinking it was going to inevitably turn violent. These things do become a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. The police also turned out in massive force, and they had a very clear plan for dealing with what was, a fairly provocative demonstration, like let's all converge on the Bank of England from 4 different sides, without then saying what we're going to do. I mean, the police had a pretty easy solution to that. Let's stick everyone in a barricade and say, right, tough. Whereupon things get hectic. And perhaps the protesters could have been slightly more aware of that, but what could they have done once it happened? As I understand it, they tried to talk to the police and the police wouldn't liaise with them in advance. I think on the day they were probably having contact, but I'm not involved with those protests, so I don't really know. So the climate camp was very interesting to me because it wasn't violent and therefore it didn't get any news coverage. The people who were slightly violent, and there were only a very small number of them who smashed up a Royal Bank of Scotland, and then a few others who got rather annoyed that they were being penned in, they hogged the headlines. And in reality, the thing that should have been the news story, i.e. the ideas behind this whole thing, just get completely buried.
People who might be watching, might be users of Green Voice, who sympathise with these ideas and who agree with the kind of things that we discussed today. What would you say to the average person who wants to see that change in the media, that change towards a more positive way of working?
I think there's 2 very important things you can do right away. One is don't just hate the media, become the media. It's almost a bit of a cliche, but there are so many outlets now where you can write your own news. It's not rocket science, journalism. It's actually pretty easy to learn the basics. And if you do learn the basics and adhere to some simple standards, keep your writing short, tight, to the point, try and source all your information, explain where you got it from, and put everything important at the top of the story so that somebody who's just going to skim read it will actually get the message quickly. Great, there you go. You've already shown there's an alternative in action. Secondly, you can put journalists under pressure. You can write to them, you can phone them up, you can send them press releases telling them about what you're doing, and then you can phone them up and ask why they didn't cover it. You can make people feel that there's a world out there that they need to respond to. That's what politicians are doing. Politicians are pumping these guys full of information, and then when it's not covered in the way they want, they phone up the editor and complain. That's why news gets skewed in a certain direction. People are much more numerous than those in power. The average guy in the street, there's 60 million of us in this country. Maybe a few 100,000 are in fairly influential positions. The rest of us could actually have a lot more influence if we think about how to bring to bear our weight of numbers. Only way to do that is to get a bit more organised, I guess. I mean, not suggesting we can have some sort of utopian revolutionary moment where everybody takes over. I mean, I think in a way somebody's got to run things, and their vested interests will always, I guess, conflict with other people's. But if we organise ourselves to put pressure more effectively, I think we can get rid of some of the more egregious abuses of power that we have in our society, and make the world slightly more oriented towards the good of ordinary people and less towards the massive accumulation of large amounts of money by people who don't really need any more.